A note represents the pitch and duration of a musical sound. Let's begin with duration or note value. Here are 5 note values. A whole note, which is a circle. A half note, which is a circle with a stem, so 2 half notes equal 1 whole note. A quarter note is like a half note, but it's filled in. 2 of these equal a half note. 4 of these equal a whole note. An eighth note is like a quarter note plus a flag. 2 of these equal a quarter note. 4 equal a half note, and 8 equal a whole note. A 16th note is like an eighth note, but with an extra flag. The pattern is the same. 2 sixteenths equal 1/8, 4 sixteenths equal 1/4, and so on. These flags can also be connected, and the stems can go up or down without any change to the duration or length. Now let's look at how these notes specifically apply to music. We first begin with a time signature. The one that I'm choosing is 4/4. The top number indicates how many regular pulses or beats are in each measure or bar. The lower number tells us what kind of note is equal to 1 beat. Therefore, if we write 4 quarter notes in 4/4, the bar is over and we add a bar line. If we do the same thing a second time, we have created 2 bars or 2 measures. The word measure and bar are used interchangeably. Let's use our 5 note values in 4/4. The whole note gets 4 beats. If we find a whole note in music with a time signature of 4/4, we would play or sing a single note, and it would last the whole bar. A half note would get half of the whole, or 2 beats. Let's listen to the beginning of Dvorak's New World Symphony's slow movement. This brass chorale has 3 measures, or 3 bars of half notes, and then 1 measure of a whole note. When any of these notes are notated, they create a rhythm. The 4 quarter notes become a regular rhythm, while if we mix up different note values, we create a less regular rhythm. For example, if we listen to the opening of the Brahms Academic Festival Overture, we see a variety of note values. In the first bar, there are 8 eighth notes. Then in bar 2 and 3, there's a pattern of a quarter note, 2 eighth notes, a quarter note, 2 eighth notes. In the 4th bar, again we have 8 eighth notes. In the 5th bar, we have a quarter, 2 eighths, and 2 quarters. And in the 6th bar, we have 2 half notes. Sometimes we see a dot after a note. Here we have a dot after a half note. Any dot like this adds half the value of the note it follows. In 4/4, our half note gets 2 beats, as we have learned. If we add a dot to that half note, it will have 3 beats. There is a second way that this can be notated. This is by adding a quarter note to the half note and putting a tie above or below it. A half note with a dot is the same as a half note tied to a quarter note. If we look at the middle of the last movement of the Beethoven Fifth Symphony, we see a dotted half note followed by a quarter note in the first bar and 4 quarter notes in the second measure. This pattern repeats numerous times. It is played 3 times by the oboes, clarinets, and bassoons, leading to a version played loud, forte, by the full orchestra. If we now look at a quarter note with a dot, of course, we've now learned that the dot is worth half the value of a quarter note, which is an eighth note. It could also be notated as a quarter note tied to an eighth note. If we look and listen to the last movement of Dvorak's New World Symphony, we see a half note followed by two quarter notes in bar 1, a dotted quarter followed by an eighth, and then a half note to complete bar 2, a half, a quarter, and 2/8 in bar 3, and then a dotted half and a quarter in bar 4 to complete the beginning of this melody. Now let's look at the beginning of the last movement of Tchaikovsky's Fourth Symphony to see some 16th notes. Bar 1 is a half note followed by a dotted quarter note and an eighth note, and then the second bar is all 16th notes. In the third bar, 3 beats of 16th notes, and then 2 eighth notes. In the fourth bar, we have some silence. We notate these silences with what we call rests. Each note value has a corresponding notation for a rest. A whole note rest is a rectangular block that sits below a line. A half note rest is a rectangular block that sits on top of a line. This is what a quarter note rest looks like. Now an eighth rest has a single flag on the stem, a 16th note has 2 flags, and a 32nd note has 3 flags on the stem. Dots following a rest are also the same as dots following notes, half of the value of the note. We have been discussing the note values in 4/4. 4/4 is the meter, and sometimes is called 4/4 time or a time signature. This can also be notated by a large C, which is called common time. 4/4 and the large C, or common time, are used interchangeably. Let's look at some other common meters. 2/2 means 2 beats in a measure with a half note getting a beat. One measure of 4/4 is equivalent to 2/2, except that the unit of pulse or beat in 2/2 is a half note, while in 4/4 is a quarter note. In both cases, 4 quarters will be in each measure, or 2 halves, or 1 whole, or 8/8, and so forth. 2/2 can also be notated with the large C that we just discussed, but with a line drawn through its center vertically. There are 2 other common meters with a 2-beat feeling. They are 2/4 and 2/8. In 2/4, a quarter note gets 1 beat, and in 2/8, an eighth note gets a beat. A march is usually notated in 2/4 time. Let's look and listen at the middle of the third movement of Tchaikovsky's Fourth Symphony. At the beginning of the movement, the string section plucking their strings, an effect called pizzicato, are playing all eighth notes. Let's look and listen to the bassoon playing a section in 2/4 from the Brahms Academic Festival Overture. In this excerpt, Brahms alternates between quarter notes and eighth notes. All of the meters that we have discussed so far are duple meters or duple time, with the beats all divisible by 2. Now let's discuss some triple meters with all the beats divisible by 3. The most common are 3/4, 3/8, 6/8, 9/8, and 12/8. 3/4 means 3 beats in a measure with a quarter note receiving 1 beat. If we look at the second movement of the Shostakovich Fifth Symphony, we see that it is in 3/4 or 3/4 time. This melody, played by the cellos and basses of the orchestra, is quite simple. The first measure, a quarter note, quarter rest, quarter note. Second measure, 3/4. The third and fourth measures both have a quarter, 2/8, and a quarter. The fifth and sixth measures, all eighth notes. The seventh, quarter, 4/8. The eighth, quarter, 4/8. The ninth and 10th, 3/4 each. Then the horns enter in bar 11 and 12, playing a half note, 2/8, half note, 2/8. Now I would like us to listen to 3/4 meter that is a very different feeling. It is a work called Black Swan by the Chinese-American composer Bright Sheng. What Bright did was to take a beautiful work written for piano by Johannes Brahms, an intermezzo, and write it for the orchestra. This process is called orchestration. This piece is also in 3/4 time, but it is a much softer and slower work than the Shostakovich we just listened to. Notice how it begins with what we call an upbeat. In this work we have 2/8 notes that precede the first full bar. These notes are called upbeats. A very common use of 3/4 is in the waltz. In this example from Robert Schumann's Third Symphony's second movement, it almost sounds like a waltz. And note that it begins also with an upbeat, this time though just 1/8 note. Three-eight is like 3/4, except that the unit of beat in 3/8 is an eighth note, while in 3/4 it is a quarter note. Here is the second movement of the Beethoven Fifth Symphony. Notice that it is in 3/8, and again it begins with an upbeat, but this time it's a dotted 16th and a 32nd note. Three-two is a less often used time signature, and as we've learned, there are 3 beats in one measure, with a half note receiving 1 beat. Let's listen to part of the finale to Stravinsky's Firebird Ballet, which is in 3/2. Here is an example of 6/4 time from American composer Joseph Schwantner's The Poet's Hour. 6 beats in a measure with a quarter note getting 1 beat. The next meter that we will discuss is 6/8, 6 beats in a measure with an eighth note getting 1 beat. This one is a little more complicated because at a slow tempo or a slow speed, we can think of each measure with 6 beats in a bar. But if the tempo is fast, we divide the bar into 2 beats with each beat worth 3/8 notes or a dotted quarter. For a slow version of 6/8, let's listen to this beautiful passage for the oboes and English horn from Ravel's ballet Daphnis and Chloe. For a fast version, let's listen to part of the Firebird's variation from Stravinsky's ballet The Firebird. Nine/8 continues with the same pattern. In a slow speed or tempo, each eighth note receives 1 beat with 9 beats in a bar. In a faster tempo, the pulse is 3, with a dotted quarter note receiving 1 pulse or 1 beat. 12/8 continues in the same pattern. In a slow tempo, 12 beats in a measure with an eighth note receiving 1 beat. If we look at the opening of Stravinsky's Firebird, we see 12/8 at the slow tempo with a feeling of 12 beats in a measure. If we look at the same introduction a few bars later, the pulse moves to 4 beats, with a dotted quarter note getting 1 beat. I would like to mention the names of the types of time signatures that we have been discussing. There are 3 types of time signatures: simple time, which includes any time signature with the upper number, the number of beats in each bar, divided by 2, such as 2/8, 2/4, 4/8, 4/4, 6/4, 8/8, 8/4, and so forth. In this category, we also include 3/4 and 3/8. In compound type signatures, the beat can be broken down into 3, as we've discussed, like 6/8, 9/8, 12/8, 15/8. We also have asymmetrical time signatures, also called complex or irregular time, which generally contain 5 or 7 beats. Let's look at a few of these. At the end of Ravel's Daphnis and Chloe, he wrote his wild finale in 5/4, a fast 5/4. In general, the 5 is divided into 3 plus 2. When we listen to the end of the Firebird, we first hear 7/4 in a fast tempo divided into 3 plus 2 plus 2, or 2 plus 2 plus 3. After a few measures, Stravinsky instructs us to play the material twice slower, and the 7/4 becomes a slow 7/4. But still divided into 3 plus 2 plus 2, or 2 plus 2 plus 3. At times, especially in popular dance forms, the meter will remain constant. All ballroom dancing fits into this category. A march would also fit into this category, remaining constant, usually in 2/4. It is also the case with most music from the 18th and 19th centuries. In the latter part of the 1800s and into the 1900s, composers started to feel free to change meters during a movement or work, sometimes quite often. The actual meters remain as we have discussed. If we look at the last movement of the Sam Jones Cello Concerto, we can see some simple changes of meter, from 2/4 to 3/4, back to 2/4, then 3/4 and 4/4. Another simple example is in Philip Glass's Harmonium Mountain. In this excerpt, he mixes the meters 2/4, 3/4, and 4/4. If we look at David Stock's work called Blast, written in 2010, we find a more complicated section of meter changers using 5/8, 7/8, 3/4, and 4/4. If we look at a 4/4 measure, we have learned that the measure can easily be divided by using various note lengths: half notes, quarter notes, 16th notes, 32nd notes, and so forth. But what if a composer would like to divide one of those quarter notes into 3 equal parts to create more rhythmic interest? We accomplish this by adding a 3 above or below a group of 3/8 notes. The 3 signifies that 3 notes are performed during the time of 1 quarter note. Let's again look at Philip Glass's Harmonium Mountain. In this passage, we see the violins playing the groups of 3 called triplets, and the violas and cellos are playing quarter notes. Then the violas join the violins, playing triplets, the cellos play the 8th notes, and the double basses play the quarter notes. This method of changing duple notes to triple notes can work in any duple meter. The composer can also divide the triple beat in different ways. For example, instead of 3 eighth notes in a beat, we could see an eighth note and a quarter note, or a quarter note and an eighth note. We still need the number 3 above or below the notes. If you look at Ravel's Dathis and Chloe, the meter is 5/4, but Ravel adds the 3 for each part to create triplets. You will see that he doesn't continue to write the 3 during the continuation of the excerpt, assuming that the performer understands the pattern. The triplet is the most common variation within a meter, but there could also be, for example, 5 notes within a quarter. Again, with a 5 above or below, or 6, or quite frankly, any number that is not common to the meter. In a triple meter like 6/8, one could do the same. 6/8 can be 1 dotted half note or 2 dotted quarter notes, or 6/8 or 12/16. We could also have a rhythm of quarter eighth or eighth quarter, or any combination that adds up to 6/8 notes. If a composer wanted 4 notes during a dotted quarter note, the number 4 would go above or below the group of notes. As you can see, the notation of rhythm can become very complicated. We will discuss this in later lessons.